The Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde, abridged and read by Stephen Tomlin. When Hiram B. Otis, the American minister to the court of St. James, bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him he was doing a very foolish thing, as there was no doubt at all that the place was haunted. Indeed, Lord Canterville himself, who was a man of the most punctilious honour, had felt it his duty to mention the fact to Mr. Otis when they came to discuss terms. "We have not cared to live in the place ourselves," said Lord Canterville, "since my grand-aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Bolton, was frightened into a fit by two skeleton hands being placed on her shoulders as she was dressing for dinner. I feel bound to tell you, Mr. Otis, that the ghost has been seen by several living members of my family, and Lady Canterville often got very little sleep at night, in consequence of the mysterious noises that came from the corridor and the library." "My lord," answered the minister, "I will take the furniture and the ghost at a valuation. I have come from a modern country, where we have everything that money can buy. I reckon that if there was such a thing as a ghost in Europe, we'd have it at home in a very short time in one of our public museums, or on the road as a show." "I fear that the ghost exists," said Lord Canterville, "though it may have resisted the overtures of your enterprising impresarios. It has been well known for 3 centuries, since 1584 in fact, and always makes its appearance before the death of any member of our family." "Well, so does the family doctor, for that matter, Lord Canterville. But there is no such thing, sir, as a ghost. If you don't mind a ghost in the house, so be it. Only you must remember, I warned you." A few weeks after this, the purchase was concluded, and at the close of the season, the minister and his family went down to Canterville Chase. Mrs. Otis, who, as Miss Lucretia R. Tappan, had been a celebrated New York belle, was now a very handsome middle-aged woman with fine eyes and a superb profile. She had a magnificent constitution and a really wonderful amount of animal spirits. Indeed, in many respects, she was quite English, and was an excellent example of the fact that we really have everything in common with America nowadays, except, of course, language. Her eldest son, christened Washington by his parents in a moment of patriotism, was a fair-haired, rather good-looking young man, well known as an excellent dancer. Miss Virginia E. Otis was a young girl of 15, a wonderful Amazon, lithe and lovely as a fawn, with a fine freedom in her large blue eyes. After Virginia came the twins, usually called the Stars and Stripes, who were both delightful boys. As Canterville Chase is 7 miles from Ascot, the nearest railway station, Mr. Otis had telegraphed for a wagonette to meet them, and they started on their drive in high spirits. It was a lovely July evening, and the air was delicate with the scent of the pine woods. Now and then they heard a wood pigeon brooding over its own sweet voice, or saw, deep in the rustling fern, the burnished breast of the pheasant. As they entered the avenue of Canterville Chase, however, the sky became suddenly overcast with clouds. A curious stillness seemed to hold the atmosphere. A great flight of rooks passed silently over their heads, and before they reached the house, some big drops of rain had fallen. Standing on the steps to receive them was an old woman, neatly dressed in black silk, with a white cap and apron. This was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper. She made them each a low curtsy as they alighted, and said in a quaint, old-fashioned manner, "I bid you welcome to Canterville Chase." Following her, they passed through the fine Tudor hall into the library, a long, low room panelled in black oak, at the end of which was a large stained-glass window. Here they found tea laid out for them, and, after taking off their wraps, they sat down and began to look around, while Mrs. Umney waited on them. Suddenly, Mrs. Otis caught sight of a dull red stain on the floor just by the fireplace, and quite unconscious of what it really signified, said to Mrs. Umney, "I'm afraid something has been spilt there." "Yes, madam," replied the old housekeeper in a low voice. "Blood has been spilt on that spot." "How horrid!" cried Mrs. Otis. I don't at all care for bloodstains in a sitting room. It must be removed at once." The old woman smiled and answered in the same low, mysterious voice. "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her own husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon survived her 9 years and disappeared suddenly under very mysterious circumstances. His body has never been discovered, but his guilty spirit still haunts the chase. The bloodstain has been much admired by tourists and others and cannot be removed." "That is all nonsense," cried Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's champion stain remover and Paragon detergent will clean it up in no time." And before the terrified housekeeper could interfere, he had fallen upon his knees and was rapidly scouring the floor with a small stick of what looked like a black cosmetic. In a few moments, no trace of the bloodstain could be seen. "I knew Pinkerton would do it," he exclaimed triumphantly as he looked round at his admiring family. But no sooner had he said these words than a terrible flash of lightning lit up the sombre room. A fearful peal of thunder made them all start to their feet, and poor Mrs. Umney fainted. In a few moments she came to, and, quite upset, she sternly warned Mr. Otis of some trouble coming to the house. "I've seen things with my own eyes, sir, that would make any Christian's hair stand on end. And many a night I'd not close my eyes in sleep for the awful things that are done here." Mr. Otis, however, and his wife warmly assured the honest soul that they were not afraid of ghosts. After invoking the blessings of Providence on her new master and mistress, and making arrangements for an increase of salary, the old housekeeper tottered off to her room. The storm raged fiercely all night, but nothing of particular note occurred. Next morning, however, when they came down to breakfast, they found the terrible stain of blood once again on the floor. "I don't think it could be the fault of the Paragon detergent," said Washington, "for I have tried it with everything. It must be the ghost." He accordingly rubbed out the stain a second time, but the second morning it appeared again. The third morning also it was there, though the library had been locked up at night by Mr. Otis himself and the key carried upstairs. The whole family were now quite interested. Mr. Otis began to suspect that he had been too dogmatic in his denial of the existence of ghosts. That night all doubts were removed forever. Mr. Otis was awakened by a curious noise in the corridor outside his room. It sounded like the clank of metal and seemed to be coming nearer every moment. He got up at once, struck a match and looked at the time. It was exactly 1 o'clock. The strange noise still continued, and with it he heard distinctly the sound of footsteps. He put on his slippers, took a small oblong file out of his dressing case and opened the door. Right in front of him he saw, in the moonlight, an old man of terrible aspect. His eyes were as red as burning coals. Long grey hair fell over his shoulders in matted coils. His garments, which were of antique cut, were soiled and ragged, and from his wrists and ankles hung heavy manacles and rusty gyves. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis calmly, "I really must insist on your oiling those chains, and have brought you for that purpose a small bottle of the Tammany Rising Sun Lubricator. It is said to be completely efficacious upon one application, and there are several testimonials to that effect on the wrapper from some of our most eminent native divines. I shall leave it here for you by the bedroom candles, and will be happy to supply you with more, should you require it." With these words, the United States minister laid the bottle down on the marble table, and closing his door, retired to rest. For a moment, the Canterville Ghost stood quite motionless in natural indignation. Then, dashing the bottle violently upon the polished floor, he fled down the corridor, uttering hollow groans and emitting a ghastly green light. Just, however, as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door was flung open. 2 little white-robed figures appeared, and a large pillow whizzed past his head. There was evidently no time to be lost, so, hastily adopting the 4th dimension of space as a means of escape, he vanished through the wainscoting, and the house became quite quiet. On reaching a small secret chamber in the left wing, he leaned up against a moonbeam to recover his breath and began to try and realise his position. Never, in a brilliant and uninterrupted career of 300 years, had he been so grossly insulted. He thought of the 4 housemaids who had gone into hysterics when he merely grinned at them through the curtains of one of the spare bedrooms. Of the rector of the parish, whose candle he had blown out as he was coming late one night from the library, and who had become a perfect martyr to nervous disorders. The furore he had excited one lovely June evening by merely playing ninepins with his own bones upon the lawn tennis ground. And after all this, some wretched modern Americans were to come and offer him the Rising Sun Lubricator and throw pillows at his head. It was quite unbearable. No ghost in history had ever been treated in this manner. Accordingly, he determined to have vengeance and remained till daylight in an attitude of deep thought. For the rest of the week, however, the family were left undisturbed, the only thing that excited any attention being the continual renewal of the bloodstain on the library floor. This certainly was very strange, as the door was always locked at night by Mr. Otis, and the windows kept closely barred. The chameleon-like colour also of the stain excited a good deal of comment. Some mornings it was a dull red, then it would be vermilion, then a rich purple, and once they found a bright emerald green. These kaleidoscopic changes naturally amused the party very much, and bets on the subject were freely made every evening. The only person who did not enter into the joke was little Virginia, who, for some unexplained reason, was always a good deal distressed at the sight of the bloodstain, and very nearly cried the morning it was emerald green. The second appearance of the ghost was on Sunday night. Shortly after they had gone to bed, they were suddenly alarmed by a fearful crash in the hall. Rushing downstairs, they found that a large suit of old armour had become detached from its stand and had fallen on the stone floor, while seated in a high-backed chair was the Canterville Ghost, rubbing his knees with an expression of acute agony on his face. The twins, having brought their pea-shooters with them, at once discharged 2 pellets on him with great accuracy of aim, while the United States Minister covered him with his revolver and called upon him, in accordance with Californian etiquette, to hold up his hands. The ghost started up with a wild shriek of rage and swept through them like a mist, extinguishing Washington Otis's candle as he passed, and so leaving them all in total darkness. On reaching the top of the staircase, he recovered himself and determined to give his celebrated peal of demonic laughter. This he had on more than one occasion found extremely useful. He accordingly laughed his most horrible laugh, till the old vaulted roof rang and rang again. But hardly had the fearful echo died away when a door opened, and Mrs. Otis came out in her dressing gown. "I am afraid you are far from well," she said, "and have brought you a bottle of Dr. Dobell's tincture. If it is indigestion, you will find it a most excellent remedy." The ghost glared at her in fury, and began at once to make preparations for turning himself into a large black dog, an accomplishment for which he was justly renowned. The sound of approaching footsteps, however, made him hesitate in his fell purpose, so he contented himself with becoming faintly phosphorescent, and vanished with a deep churchyard groan, just as the twins had come up to him. On reaching his room, he entirely broke down, and became a prey to the most violent agitation. The vulgarity of the twins and the gross materialism of Mrs. Otis were naturally extremely annoying, but what really distressed him most was that he'd been unable to wear the suit of mail. He had hoped that even modern Americans would be thrilled by the sight of a spectre in armour. Besides, it was his own suit. He had worn it with great success at the Kenilworth tournament, and had been highly complimented on it by no less a person than the Virgin Queen herself. Yet when he had put it on, he had been completely overpowered by the weight of the huge breastplate and steel casque, and had fallen heavily on the stone pavement, barking both his knees severely, and bruising the knuckles of his right hand. For some days after this, he was extremely ill, and hardly stirred out of his room at all, except to keep the bloodstain in proper repair. However, by by taking great care of himself, he recovered and resolved to make a third attempt to frighten the United States minister and his family. He selected Friday, August the 17th for his appearance, and spent most of that day in looking over his wardrobe, ultimately deciding in favour of a large slouched hat with a red feather, a winding sheet frilled at the wrists and neck, and a rusty dagger. Towards evening, a violent storm of rain came on, and the wind was so high that all the windows and doors in the old house shook and rattled. In fact, it was just such weather as he loved. His plan of action was this. He was to make his way quietly to Washington Otis's room, gibber at him from the foot of the bed, and stab himself 3 times in the throat to the sound of low music. He bore Washington a special grudge, being quite aware that it was he who was in the habit of removing the famous Canterville bloodstain by means of Pinkerton's Paragon Detergent. Having reduced the reckless and foolhardy youth to a condition of abject terror, he was then to proceed to the room occupied by the United States minister and his wife, and there to place a clammy hand on Mrs. Otis's forehead, while he hissed into her trembling husband's ear the awful secrets of the charnel house. With regard to little Virginia, he had not quite made up his mind. She had never insulted him in any way, and was pretty and gentle. A few hollow groans from the wardrobe, he thought, would be more than sufficient. As for the twins, he was quite determined to teach them a lesson. The first thing to be done was, of course, to sit upon their chests, so as to produce the stifling sensation of nightmare. Then, to stand between them in the form of a green, icy-cold corpse till they became paralysed with fear, and finally to throw off the winding sheet and crawl round the room with white bleached bones and one rolling eyeball. At 10:30, he heard the family going to bed. For some time he was disturbed by wild shrieks of laughter from the twins, who, with the light-hearted gaiety of schoolboys, were evidently amusing themselves before they retired to rest. But at 11:15, all was still, and as midnight sounded, he sallied forth. The owl beat against the window panes, the raven croaked from the old yew tree, and the wind wandered moaning round the house like a lost soul. But the Otis family slept, unconscious of their doom. He stepped stealthily out of the wainscoting, with an evil smile on his cruel wrinkled mouth. On and on he glided, like an evil shadow, the very darkness seeming to loathe him as he passed. Finally, he reached the corner of the passage that led to luckless Washington's room. For a moment he paused there and chuckled to himself, and turned the corner. But no sooner had he done so, than with a piteous wail of terror he fell back, and hid his blanched face in his long bony hands. Right in front of him was standing a horrible spectre, motionless as a carven image, and monstrous as a madman's dream. Its head was bald and furnished, its face round and fat and white, and hideous laughter seemed to have writhed its features into an eternal grin. From the eyes streamed rays of scarlet light. The mouth was a wide well of fire, and a hideous garment, like to his own, swathed with its silent snows the Titan form. On its breast was a placard with strange writing in antique characters. Some scroll of shame, it seemed, some record of wild sins, some awful calendar of crime. And, with its right hand, it bore aloft a falchion of gleaming steel. Never having seen a ghost before, he naturally was terribly frightened, and, after a second hasty glance at the awful phantom, fled back to his room, tripping up in his long winding sheet as he sped down the corridor. Once in the privacy of his own apartment, he flung himself down on a small pallet bed and hid his face under the clothes. After a time, however, the brave old Canterville spirit asserted itself, and he determined to go and speak to the other ghost as soon as it was daylight. Accordingly, just as the dawn was touching the hills with silver, he returned towards the spot where he had first laid eyes on the grisly phantom, feeling that, after all, 2 ghosts were better than 1, and that, by the aid of his new friend, he might safely grapple with the twins. On reaching the spot, however, a terrible sight met his gaze. Something had evidently happened to the spectre, for the light had entirely faded from its hollow eyes. The gleaming falchion had fallen from its hand, and it was leaning up against the wall in a strained and uncomfortable attitude. He rushed forward and seized it in his arms, when, to his horror, the head slipped off and rolled onto the floor. The body assumed a recumbent posture, and he found himself clasping a white dimity bed curtain, with a sweeping brush, a kitchen cleaver, and a hollow turnip lying at his feet. Unable to understand this curious transformation, he clutched the placard with feverish haste, and there, in the grey morning light, he read these fearful words: "Ye Otis Ghost, ye only true and original spook, beware of ye imitations. All others are counterfeit." The whole thing flashed across him. He had been tricked, foiled, and outwitted. The old Canterville look came into his eyes. He ground his toothless gums together, and raising his withered hands high above his head, swore a terrible oath. At 7:30, the arrival of the housemaids made him give up his fearful vigil, and he stalked back to his room, thinking of his vain oath and baffled purpose. There he consulted several books of ancient chivalry, of which he was exceedingly fond. He then retired to a comfortable lead coffin and stayed there till evening. The next day, the ghost was very weak and tired. The terrible excitement of the last 4 weeks was beginning to have its effect. His nerves were completely shattered, and he started at the slightest noise. For 5 days he kept his room, and at last made up his mind to give up the point of the bloodstain on the library floor. If the Otis family did not want it, they clearly did not deserve it. They were evidently people on a low material plane of existence, and quite incapable of appreciating the symbolic value of such phenomena. It is quite true that his life had been very evil, but upon the other hand, he was most conscientious in all things connected with the supernatural. For the next 3 Saturdays, accordingly, he traversed the corridor as usual between midnight and 3 o'clock, taking every possible precaution against being either heard or seen. He removed his boots, trod as lightly as possible on the old worm-eaten boards, wore a large black velvet cloak, and was careful to use the Rising Sun Lubricator for oiling his chains. It was with a good deal of difficulty that he brought himself to adopt this last mode of protection. However, one night, while the family were at dinner, he slipped into Mr. Otis's bedroom and carried off the bottle. He felt a little humiliated at first, but afterwards was sensible enough to see that there was a great deal to be said for the invention, and, to a certain degree, it served his purpose. One night, he glided out of the wainscoting and crept down the corridor. On reaching the room occupied by the twins, he found the door just ajar. Wishing to make an effective entrance, he flung it wide open, when a heavy jug of water fell right down on him, wetting him to the skin and just missing his left shoulder by a couple of inches. At the same moment, he heard stifled shrieks of laughter proceeding from the four-poster bed. The shock to his nervous system was so great that he fled back to his room as hard as he could go, and the next day he was laid up with a severe cold. He now gave up all hope of ever frightening this rude American family, and contented himself, as a rule, with creeping about the passages in slippers, with a thick red muffler round his throat for fear of draughts, and a small arquebus, in case he should be attacked by the twins. The final blow he received occurred on the 19th of September. He had gone downstairs to the great entrance hall, feeling sure that there, at any rate, he would be quite unmolested. He was simply but neatly clad in a long shroud spotted with churchyard mould, had tied up his jaw with a strip of yellow linen, and carried a small lantern and a sexton's spade. It was about 2:15 o'clock in the morning, and as far as he could ascertain, no one was stirring. As he was strolling towards the library, however, to see if there were any traces left of the bloodstain, suddenly there leaped out on him from a dark corner 2 figures, who waved their arms wildly above their heads and shrieked out "Boo!" in his ear. Seized with a panic, which, under the circumstances, was only natural, he rushed for the staircase, but found Washington Otis waiting for him there with the big garden syringe. And being thus hemmed in by his enemies on every side, and driven almost to bay, he vanished into the great iron stove, which, fortunately for him, was not lit, and had to make his way home through the flues and chimneys, arriving at his own room in a terrible state of dirt, disorder, and despair. After this, he was not seen again on any nocturnal expedition. The twins lay in wait for him on several occasions, and strewed the passages with nutshells every night, to the great annoyance of their parents and the servants. But it was of no avail. It was quite evident that his feelings were so wounded that he would not appear. Mr. Otis subsequently resumed his great work on the history of the Democratic Party, on which he had been engaged for some years. Mrs. Otis organised a wonderful clam bake, which amazed the whole county. The boys took to lacrosse, poker, and other American national games, and Virginia rode about the lanes on her pony, accompanied by the young Duke of Cheshire, who had come to spend the last week of his holidays at Canterville Chase. It was generally assumed that the ghost had gone away, and in fact Mr. Otis wrote a letter to that effect to Lord Canterville, who, in reply, expressed his great pleasure at the news and sent his congratulations. The Otises, however, were deceived, for the ghost was still in the house, and though now almost an invalid, was by no means ready to let matters rest. A few days after this, Virginia and her curly-haired cavalier went out riding on Brockley Meadows, where she tore her habit so badly in getting through a hedge that, on their return home, she made up her mind to go up by the back staircase so as not to be seen. As she was running past the tapestry chamber, the door of which happened to be open, she fancied she saw someone inside, and thinking it was her mother's maid, who sometimes used to bring her work there, looked in to ask her to mend her habit. To her immense surprise, however, it was the Canterville Ghost himself. He was sitting by the window, watching the ruined gold of the yellowing trees fly through the air. His head was leaning on his hand, and his whole attitude was one of extreme depression. Indeed, so forlorn and so much out of repair did he look, that little Virginia, whose first idea had been to run away and lock herself in her room, was filled with pity and determined to try and comfort him. "I am so sorry for you," she said, "but my brothers are going back to Eton tomorrow, and then if you behave yourself, no one will annoy you." "It is absurd asking me to behave myself," he answered, looking round in astonishment at the pretty little girl who ventured to address him. "Quite absurd. I must rattle my chains, and groan through keyholes, and walk about at night, if that is what you mean. It is my only reason for existing." "There is no reason at all for existing, and you know you have been very wicked. Mrs. Umney told us, the first day we arrived here, that you had killed your wife." "Well, I quite admit it," said the ghost petulantly. "But it was a purely family matter, and concerned no one else." "It is very wrong to kill anyone," said Virginia. "My wife was very plain, never had my ruffs properly starched, and knew nothing about cookery. However, it's no matter now, for it's all over, and I don't think it was very nice of her brothers to starve me to death, even though I did kill her." "Starve you to death? Oh, Mr. Ghost, I mean Sir Simon, are you hungry? I have a sandwich in my case. Would you like it?" "No, thank you. I never eat anything now. But it is very kind of you, all the same. And you are much nicer than the rest of your horrid, rude, vulgar, dishonest family." "Stop!" cried Virginia, stamping her foot. "It is you who are rude, and horrid, and vulgar. And as for dishonesty, you know you stole the paints out of my box to try and furbish up that ridiculous bloodstain in the library. First, you took all my reds, including the vermilion, and I couldn't do any more sunsets. Then you took the emerald green and the chrome yellow, and finally I had nothing left but indigo and Chinese white, and could only do moonlight scenes, which are always depressing to look at, and not at all easy to paint. I never told on you, though I was very much annoyed, and it was ridiculous, the whole thing. For who ever heard of emerald green blood? Well, really, said the ghost, rather meekly, what was I to do? It is a very difficult thing to get real blood nowadays, and as your brother began it all with his Paragon detergent, I certainly saw no reason why I should not have your paints. As for colour, that's always a matter of taste. The Cantervilles have blue blood, for instance, the very bluest in England. But I know you Americans don't care for this sort of thing. You know nothing about it, and the best thing you can do is emigrate and improve your mind. My father will be only too happy to give you a free passage, and though there is a heavy duty on spirits of every kind, there will be no difficulty about the customs. Once in New York, you are sure to be a great success. I know lots of people there who'd give $100,000 to have a grandfather, and much more than that to have a family ghost. I am so lonely and unhappy, and I really don't know what to do. I want to go to sleep, and I cannot. That's quite absurd. You've merely to go to bed and blow out the candle. I have not slept for 300 years, he said sadly, as Virginia's beautiful blue eyes opened in wonder, and I am so tired. Virginia grew quite grave and came towards him, and kneeling down at his side, looked up into his old withered face. Poor, poor ghost, she murmured. Have you no place where you can sleep? Far away, beyond the pine woods, he answered. There is a little garden. There the grass grows long and deep. There are the great white stars of the hemlock flower. And there the nightingale sings all night long, and the cold crystal moon looks down, and the yew tree spreads out its giant arms over the sleepers. Virginia's eyes grew dim with tears, and she hid her face in her hands. You mean the Garden of Death, she whispered. Yes, death. Death must be so beautiful. To lie in the soft brown earth, with the grasses waving above one's head, and listen to silence. To have no yesterday and no tomorrow. To forget time, to forget life, to be at peace. Now, you can help me. You can open for me the portals of death's house. For love is always with you, and love is stronger than death is. Virginia trembled. A cold shudder ran through her, and for a few moments there was silence. She felt as if she was in a terrible dream. Then the ghost spoke again, and his voice sounded like the sighing of the wind. Have you ever read the old prophecy on the library window? Oh, often, cried the little girl, looking up. I know it quite well. It's painted in curious black letters and is difficult to read. There are only 6 lines. When a golden girl can win prayer from out the lips of sin, when the barren almond bears and a little child gives away its tears, then shall all the house be still and peace come to Canterville. But I don't know what they mean. They mean, he said sadly, that you must weep with me for my sins, because I have no tears, and pray with me for my soul, because I have no faith. And then, if you have always been sweet and good and gentle, the angel of death will have mercy on me. You will see fearful shapes in darkness, and wicked voices will whisper in your ear, but they will not harm you. For against the purity of a child, the powers of hell cannot prevail. Virginia made no answer, and the ghost wrung his hands in wild despair as he looked down at her bowed golden head. Suddenly, she stood up, very pale and with a strange light in her eyes. I am not afraid, she said firmly, and I will ask the angel to have mercy on you. He rose from his seat with a faint cry of joy, and taking her hand, bent over it with old-fashioned grace and kissed it. His fingers were as cold as ice, and his lips burned like fire, but Virginia did not falter as he led her across the dusky room. On the faded green tapestry were broidered little huntsmen. They blew their tasselled horns and with their tiny hands waved to her to go back. "Go back, little Virginia," they cried. "Go back." But the ghost clutched her hand more tightly, and she shut her eyes against them. Horrible animals with lizard tails and goggle eyes blinked at her from the carven chimney-piece and murmured, "Beware, little Virginia, beware, we may never see you again." But the ghost glided on more swiftly, and Virginia did not listen. When they reached the end of the room, he stopped and muttered some words she could not understand. She opened her eyes and saw the wall slowly fading away like a mist, and a great black cavern in front of her. A bitter cold wind swept around them, and she felt something pulling at her dress. "Quick, quick," cried the ghost, "or it'll be too late." And in a moment the wainscoting had closed behind them, and the tapestry chamber was empty. About 10 minutes later, the bell rang for tea, and as Virginia did not come down, Mrs. Otis sent up one of her footmen to tell her. After a little time he returned and said that he could not find Miss Virginia anywhere. As she was in the habit of going out to the garden every evening to get flowers for the dinner table, Mrs. Otis was not at all alarmed at first. But when 6 o'clock struck, and Virginia did not appear, she became really agitated, and sent the 3 boys out to look for her, while she herself and Mr. Otis searched every room in the house. At 6:30, the boys came back and said they could find no trace of Virginia anywhere. They were all now in the greatest state of excitement, and did not know what to do. The carp pond had been dragged, and the whole chase thoroughly gone over, but without any result. It was evident that, for that night at any rate, Virginia was lost to them. Supper was a melancholy meal, as hardly anyone spoke. When they had finished, Mr. Otis, in spite of the entreaties of the young Duke of Cheshire, ordered them all to bed, saying that nothing more could be done that night, and that he would telegraph in the morning to Scotland Yard for some detectives to be sent down immediately. Just as they were passing out of the dining room, midnight began to boom from the clock tower, and when the last stroke sounded, they heard a crash and a sudden shrill cry. A dreadful peal of thunder shook the house. A strain of unearthly music floated through the air. A panel at the top of the staircase flew back with a loud noise, and out on the landing, looking very pale and white, with a little casket in her hand, stepped Virginia. In a moment they had all rushed up to her. Mrs. Otis clasped her passionately in her arms. The Duke smothered her with violent kisses, and the twins executed a wild war dance round the group. "Good heavens, child, where have you been?" said Mr. Otis, rather angrily, thinking that she'd been playing some foolish trick on them. "We've been looking all over for you, and your mother has been frightened to death. You must never play these practical jokes any more." "Except on the ghost," shrieked the twins as they capered about. "My own darling, thank God you are found. You must never leave my side again," murmured Mrs. Otis, as she kissed the trembling child and smoothed the tangled gold of her hair. "Papa," said Virginia quietly, "I have been with a ghost. He is dead, and you must come and see him. He had been very wicked, but he was really sorry for all that he'd done, and he gave me this box of beautiful jewels before he died." The whole family gazed at her in mute amazement, but she was quite grave and serious, and, turning round, she led them through the opening in the wainscoting down a narrow secret corridor, Washington following with a lighted candle, which he had caught up from the table. Finally, they came to a great oak door, studded with rusty nails. When Virginia touched it, it swung back on its heavy hinges, and they found themselves in a little low room with a vaulted ceiling and one tiny grated window. Embedded in the wall was a huge iron ring, and chained to it was a gaunt skeleton that was stretched out at full length on the stone floor and seemed to be trying to grasp with its long fleshless fingers an old-fashioned trencher and ewer that were placed just outside of its reach. The jug had evidently once been filled with water, as it was covered inside with green mould. There was nothing on the trencher but a pile of dust. Virginia knelt down beside the skeleton and folding her little hands together, began to pray silently, while the rest of the party looked on in wonder at the terrible tragedy whose secret was now disclosed to them. "Hello!" suddenly exclaimed one of the twins, who had been looking out of the window to try and discover in what wing of the house the room was situated. "The old withered almond tree has blossomed. I can see the flowers quite plainly in the moonlight." "God has forgiven him," said Virginia gravely, as she rose to her feet, and a beautiful light seemed to illumine her face. "What an angel you are!" cried the young Duke, and he put his arms around her neck and kissed her. 4 days after these curious incidents, a funeral started from Canterville Chase at about 11 o'clock at night. The hearse was drawn by 8 black horses, each of which carried on its head a great tuft of nodding ostrich plumes, and the leaden coffin was covered by a rich purple pall, on which was embroidered in gold the Canterville coat of arms. By the side of the hearse and the coaches walked the servants with lighted torches, and the whole procession was wonderfully impressive. Lord Canterville was the chief mourner, having come up from Wales to attend the funeral, and sat in the first carriage along with little Virginia. Then came the United States Minister and his wife, then Washington and the 3 boys, and in the last carriage was Mrs. Umney, the housekeeper. A deep grave had been dug in the corner of the churchyard, just under the old yew tree, and the service was read in the most impressive manner by the rector. As the coffin was being lowered into the grave, Virginia stepped forward and laid on it a large cross made of white and pink almond blossoms. As she did so, the moon came out from behind a cloud and flooded with its silent silver the little churchyard, and from a distant copse a nightingale began to sing. She thought of the ghost's description of the Garden of Death. Her eyes became dim with tears, and she hardly spoke a word during the drive home. The next morning, before Lord Canterville went up to town, Mr. Otis had an interview with him on the subject of the jewels the ghost had given to Virginia. They were perfectly magnificent, especially a certain ruby necklace with its old Venetian setting, and their value was so great that Mr. Otis felt considerable scruples about allowing his daughter to accept them. Lord Canterville, however, insisted the minister should allow his daughter to retain the present the ghost had given her, and when, in the spring of 1890, the young Duchess of Cheshire was presented at the Queen's first drawing room on the occasion of her marriage, her jewels were the universal theme of admiration. For Virginia received the coronet, which is the reward of all good little American girls, and was married to her boy lover as soon as he came of age. They were both so charming, and they loved each other so much that everyone was delighted. Mr. Otis walked up the aisle of St. George's, Hanover Square, with his daughter leaning on his arm, the proudest man the whole length and breadth of England. The Duke and Duchess, after the honeymoon was over, went down to Canterville Chase, and on the day after their arrival walked over to the lonely churchyard by the pine woods. It had been decided to engrave on Sir Simon's tombstone just his initials and the verse from the library window. The Duchess had brought with her some lovely roses, which she strewed upon the grave, and after they had stood by it for some time, strolled into the ruined chancel of the old abbey, where they sat down on a fallen pillar. "Virginia, a wife should have no secrets from her husband." "Dear Cecil, I have no secrets from you." "Oh, yes, you have," he answered, smiling. "You have never told me what happened to you when you were locked up with a ghost." "I have never told anyone, Cecil," said Virginia gravely. "I know that, but you might tell me." "Oh, please don't ask me, Cecil. I cannot tell you. Poor Sir Simon. I owe him a great deal. Yes, don't laugh, Cecil. I really do. He made me see what life is, and what death signifies, and why love is stronger than both." The Duke rose and kissed his wife lovingly. "You can have your secret, as long as I have your heart," he murmured. "You have always had that, Cecil. And you will tell our children some day, won't you?" Virginia blushed.